this morning. So thanks for joining us in our session. This is an organised session, a symposium entitled Scholar Activism That Wins. And unlike the other sessions that are organised in the conference, we're all people that knew each other in advance. So we came together and decided to organise a session at this conference. All of our contributors today are part of the Scholar Activists Network. And that has a goal of supporting scholar activists. And in the session today, we'll be talking about how scholar activists can support progressive social movements while simultaneously thriving within academia. We'll hear some experiences from scholar activists, and there'll also be lots of opportunities for you to share your experiences and to ask questions. So perhaps we could start off. We're really interested to know why you decided to join us today. So perhaps you could share, please, in the chat, what drew you to the session today. So just if you could just take a couple of moments to share with us a couple of thoughts about why you've come to this session in the chat, that'd be great. And just to very briefly, before I hand over to my colleague Toyen to introduce the Scholar Activists Network. It was started in February 2021, and that was a time when many of us in academia were feeling isolated, but perhaps in particular scholar activists. It has a list, an online listserv, which you'll be very welcome to join. It won't swamp your inbox. So I suppose we normally get between 3 and 5 emails a week about events or resources that are of interest. We also meet together online every 6 to 8 weeks. And typically a scholar activist will share something they're working on, perhaps a problem or a challenge, and invite feedback and discussion in a friendly and supportive environment. And we're trying to replicate that experience today. So we'll be having some short contributions from my colleagues, but also plenty of chance for discussion, people to share their experiences and their thoughts. We're also keen to connect with other networks. So if you're involved with other formal or informal groupings of scholar activists, we'd love to hear about those and to be able to connect with them. It really cuts across different disciplines. So the Scholar Activist Network welcomes people who work on environmental justice, anti-racism, structural violence, social justice issues, migration, housing, squatting, a whole range of different topics and issues. But we often find we have things in common methodologically. So you can find you've got lots of common ground with someone working on perhaps a different issue, but facing very similar challenges within academia. So without more ado, I'll hand over to my colleague Toyen, who's a lecturer in social anthropology at UCL and also a scholar activist. So Toyen, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Toyen. I'm, as Aline just said, welcome, and I'm a lecturer in social anthropology. I teach nationalism, ethnicity and race, and a little bit on decolonizing anthropology. Now, what I'm going to do before I get going, I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully we don't have any technical gremlins. So you should, with a bit of luck, be able to see my screen. Is everyone okay? I see some nods there. Yes, no, yes. You can see the
Yes, you're all
screen.
good. Yep, that's great.
Excellent. Okay. And I'm just going to read a short paper, just a little bit of background. It was a little bit longer. I kind of initially framed it in the idea as a trial, putting scholar activism on trial, but there wasn't enough time to do that in such a short piece. So hopefully we can have a little discussion around those kind of ideas. But let me get started, and then we'll kind of like talk about the issues. On the 2nd of May, 2024, US police officers used rubber bullets and tear gas to remove activist encampments erected by non-violent protesters on university campuses across America. The students involved were calling for institutions to either boycott, divest, or sanction organizations involved in the killing of innocent Palestinian civilians by Israel's military occupation in Gaza. Now, at the same time, across the Atlantic, an open conference on Gaza and anthropology was held at London School of Economics, and scholars from LSE, Goldsmith University, and University College London reflected on what meaningful role existed for the discipline and higher education overall when established conventions on academic freedom and human rights had given way to institutional silencing and complicity in acts of infanticide, ecocide, and educide. Now, taken separately, these two examples as scholars as activists and vice versa with students could erroneously be interpreted as different competing forms of public and academic rituals for securing social change or justice. Yet together, they make visible the university's role as both a space and forum to address politically contentious issues of life and death, both on and off campus. Indeed, Foucault may very well have defined these matters as both being public representations of biopower, that is, the regulation of life through an array of institutions, including the academy, and the ability to determine which populations, indeed which individuals, to make live and who to let die. However, understanding how Foucault's model applies to today's university requires considering Plato and Aristotle's original philosophical vision for the academy. Hoping the images kind of like give you a sense of what's going on in my mind. I can unpack it all later on. So if we draw upon Plato, now Plato argued that the poets, who are the closest to what we would today term as public intellectuals and activists, they would be excluded from higher education. And this is basically to prevent them from spreading misinformation that led what they would refer as young learners away from pursuing true knowledge. And the contrast in Aristotle's view, his position on the issue was less critical. He recognized that literature with aspirational, aesthetic qualities had an educative role in society, and it was capable of imparting moral and intellectual ideas. However, this is not to suggest that Aristotle regarded poetry as a vehicle to advocate for social change, because he didn't. Both philosophers held the view that one could not engage in the intellectual pursuit of higher education and simultaneously place theory in service to the activities or activities of practice. Now, I state this because going right back to the foundation of the university is really important to understand how it started and kind of like use it as a barometer of where we are now. Because I would suggest that today being labeled an activist in a university setting still has pejorative connotations, just as the concept of irrationality remains an expletive across science. Indeed, such biases emerge from a common force of the society, which asserts that we can explain the mysteries and challenges faced by humanity affecting our planet, indeed the universe, through dispassionate modes of rational thought. Of course, this is the only way we can understand things, right? We must be rational, we must submerge all our emotions, become androids, you know. However, excluding public intellectuals, artists, and activists from contributing to and shaping debates that affects us all is an arrogant act, which the scholars Thompson, Frank, and Gleiser label as enabling the blind spot. Now, they've called this an artifact of triumphalism in science. And this, if we think about Aristotle again, he sees activist art and literature solely through an aesthetic lens, not an intellectual or epistemic lens. Now, this, if you think about it, is a puzzling argument, especially if you consider higher education has always been home to transgressive thinking and countercultural movements opposing institutional forms of violence enabled through the power of academic discourse. Perhaps our problem with recognizing this as a fact stems from an atavistic belief that the universe exists not as a moral necessity to enrich all of humanity, but as an internal struggle between the elites that advocate and oppose ideas based on their political aesthetics, even if this means violently displacing logic and human-centered ethics for a reparative pedagogy of hope. Now, in conclusion, I want to say that as a decolonial anthropologist, I believe the academy is torn between adherents advocating for the radical conservation of racial capitalism and others like myself seeking the abolition of carceral societies. However, I hope we can all agree that universities must work hard to remain relevant to the social and metaphysical worlds in which they exist to avoid intellectual stagnation and the decline of higher education's moral authority. With hindsight, we can now appreciate that Einstein's riposte about imagination being more important than intelligence equally applies to the indisputable role and value of activist thinking in higher education. Now, my preferred method of doing this relies on the higher education sector utilizing epistemic disobedience, and organic intellectuals able to disrupt cognitive economies of ignorance for a critical, ethical, transformative form of knowledge production, which is dedicated to serving all of humanity. So I'm going to leave it there. So thank you for listening with me, and perhaps we can have a quick chat. More, you got any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Toyin, for that provocation. And we wanted to perhaps replicate in this session some of the experience we have when we come together as a group of scholar activists, and rather than having lots of formal PowerPoint presentations, to allow lots of time for discussion. We're getting lots of stuff come through in the chat, which is great. One thing that seems to come through from several of the comments is people needing hope. So one of the observations people have made is this session seems to be the antithesis of academia, which has become quite sad or downtrodden. Someone else saying they're seeking some hope and inspiration in the current climate. So Toyin, what have you got to be hopeful about at the moment? How can we bring some hope?
I think it's important to remember that the academy, in whatever form, whether you're thinking about the Lyceum and its incarnation in that guise, or kind of like as we see it now, has always had bastions of hope. Has always had been these enclaves of scholar activists within them, because that's the only way intellectual thought can grow, through transgression. There has to be those who argue against the status quo, even just to test theories. And so even though, as our spaces become more neoliberal, that become more commodity-based, more kind of like a credentialization. That's essentially what universities are doing now, credentializing our knowledge in many ways to provide students with a product. Always remember that actually part of that journey, there is still space for mischief making, and I'm talking about intellectual mischief making, epistemic disobedience, as would talk about. And this is something to be hopeful for, because if we succumb to the idea that how we're assessed, how we are accepted into journals, how our publications must conform with kind of these conservative, very narrow, very strict. The keynote presenter, he made some really great points about some of the problems about ranking systems and how it excludes alternative knowledge paradigms. If we start to think that is all the university is, that all higher education is, then of course we're going to be hopeless. But the truth of the matter is, no, that's more like a performance. That's more like a dance to be secure in our life choices, to make sure we can eat, we can put a roof over our heads. True academic discourse is actually hopeful, because it is about testing ideas, new ideas, old ideas, creative ideas, and finding others that we can have that discussion with.
Yeah. And that's, I guess, part of the provocation for this session, that, as you say, we need to eat, we need to keep a roof over our heads, and hopefully even thrive within academia, while at the same time supporting many of these social causes that we hold as so important. So we're quite a small group. We've got about 20 people here. So if anyone would like to put their hand up and ask their question, or if you're feeling shy, or if your internet's a bit wobbly, then also completely fine to put a question in the chat. But yeah, questions, observations. Stella, over to you. Who got their hand in first there?
Thank you. Yeah, Twain, I wanted to ask, like, how do you practice and encourage epistemic disobedience, kind of like in a day-to-day sense? Like, what kind of like concrete things do you do, and what advice would you have for other academics so that we could take that into our practices?
Okay. I mean, I'm quite lucky that I came to the academy backwards, in the sense that I had a career as a scholar activist long before I joined the academy. I've had a lifelong, I'm a Pan-Africanist. I've been engaged in human rights, and so much of the rules and the rigidity that's inside the university, I came to them with a kind of like a almost dissenting like attitude. It was either accept me as I am or not at all. And I understand not everyone can do that. But one of the things that does give me is this understanding that actually, if you do break some of those rules, so maybe you reference papers and kind of like scholars who aren't recognized as canon, the world doesn't crumble. If you do talk to interlocutors who are deemed to be ban or heterodoxy, and like, oh, you must never talk to them because their ideas are going to bring around as a plague upon your kin and their folk, actually, nah, not really. And also, if you ask about how you do in a day-to-day life, one of the things I always remind everyone to do is build your clan. You just need a couple of other people, and you validate each other. So you kind of like can test ideas outside the spaces which are trying to get you to conform. And then play with those ideas before subjecting it to the scrutiny of the system, for want of a better phrase. There are other ways of doing it. I'm talking as a social anthropologist. Of course, if you're a physicist or you're a chemist, you've got to be a bit more careful. We don't want to start, putting together new chemicals and creating explosions on campus. But the idea that we should actually, not shy away from what would happen if we did mix. Do not mix with do not mix. What would happen? And then start playing with the idea, well, how can we create an environment to test what would happen? These are the kind of ideas I'm trying to say that we need to normalize. And this is what epistemic disobedience is. It's not pouring scorn on established norms and established ideas. That's not what it is. I'm still a nerd, right? I still like fact. I still like data. I still love my sci-fi. But it is about pushing those boundaries, retesting them, recognizing that the world is very changing. And at the heart of my paper is really the lived experience as part of the academic journey. So we can talk about the Earth being round and pour scorn on flat earthers. But how many of us could say with 100% certainty that if we lived in the era before we had a concept of gravity, that we wouldn't have agreed that the Earth was flat? So it's kind of like recognizing that knowledge is always shifting, always growing, and our ways of interpreting what knowledge is and the ideas we have must always face scrutiny, even if they seem intractable, if they seem like it's always been this way. That's really not the case.
Thanks, Toyin, for those thoughtful but also hopeful observations. That's really helpful. A question from Feng Ling there. Thanks for your critical reflections. How do you feel about Plato's vision in the current HE, driven very much by financial sustainability? She didn't put that in quotes, but I'm putting that in quotes. Financial sustainability.
I mean, I think Plato's like. Okay, two things. One, even though I did it in my paper, and it's a short paper, so I was limited to how far I can go. I don't like the idea of placing higher education as the invention of Plato and Aristotle. That's kind of like one of those narratives that just regurgitates this doctrine that knowledge is Eurocentric and it's always been Eurocentric, and other peoples around the world have never had institutions of learning. That's complete nonsense. But what I liked about Plato was that he liked the idea of poetry. He liked the idea of recognizing the role for, I won't say emotion, but of artistic transgressions, of reinterpretations. And I think that Plato would be, obviously I don't know that. I would say that Plato would be upset if the models that demand financial, financial sustainability, which means that there are caps on student numbers, there are limits to which topics can be taught, because of course things like the arts are said to not be productive to a modern society, which is complete nonsense, because often it's the arts that explains the phenomenon that science can't explain in a modern society. And I say modern with inverted commas. I think he'd be very upset about that. I think he would be arguing that actually we're missing the point, that we cannot understand anything in its totality if we only use Aristotelian type of inquiry, if we only draw upon positivist ideas. And so therefore there is a need for us to actually interrogate ideas from an artistic, from an aesthetic, from evocative, emotive perspective to get a holistic vision. And that's it. He was still conservative, despite what we might read. He was still, so this idea that the activists could exist inside the academy. He wouldn't quite go that far. We would argue that young people didn't have the experience to control their emotions, so therefore we must limit and curtail how far they could expand with these crazy notions of aesthetics and freedom, etc. But at the heart of his message about the Plato's not being thrown out of the Republic is this mission of recognizing that pure logic by itself isn't really what knowledge making is about. It's not the intellectual pursuit in its totality. I hope that helps. It's a long way. I told you I'm a nerd, right? So.
And yeah, that's a really interesting reflection there, Tony. We've got a question from Tony, who I think would like to unmute himself. And yeah, go for it, Tony. Tony, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. Just to ask really about these fugitive terms that you're looking at, really, is what if hope is in short supply, then joy is even in shorter supply. So how do these terms, that we're kind of not allowed to use, like hope and courage, joy, how do these fit into really a kind of a philosophical position of disobedience?
Okay, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I'd say that we're not allowed to use them. I'm a social anthropologist, and we have an anthropology of joy. We have an anthropology of hope. I mean, anything that humans create is up for study. So we can use those terms. But when you talk about epistemic disobedience, if we look at Escobar's conception of what this means, and he refers to a concept called Brinvier, which is the good life. And it's talking about actually knowledge making should be in pursuit of the good life, not just for an elite, but for everyone. Then to define the good life is not just not to draw upon pain and violence and discrimination and inequalities, but it is also to recognize that part of the human experience is joy, it is hope, it is fear. It encompasses love, it encompasses hate. And so it's actually a valid area of inquiry. And so epistemic disobedience isn't, and this is the problem, because we are in a situation where we do live in a world that is dominated by racial capitalism. And so we're dealing with inequalities based on patriarchal systems like gender, on sexualities, on all ethnic identities. We tend to gravitate to the cause that affects us the most in our lived experience. But if we're taking a really centric perspective on this, we're looking at it from a human point of view, then we must recognize that actually hope, the manufacturing of hope, the manufacturing of joy, these are all parts of the human endeavor. The survival of loss, when we lose people, in death, or when we lose possessions or relationships, these are all parts of the human condition. And so it's not just enough to view success in the intellectual realm, in the higher education realm, as being able to achieve, a first or 2-1 and then get credentials that enables us to have a job and then to have money so we can live. No, that's far from the totality of the human experience. You'll find that the quality of life that many people who do not have all those things, those credentials, those financial resources, still live meaningful, happy, productive lives. We might not define them in the same way that they don't own a Porsche if that rocks your boat. They don't own like a mansion if that's the sort of thing that rocks your boat. But actually they do have joy. They do have hope. They do have pain. They do have trauma. And once we recognize that we cannot narrow human aspirations in those simple terms, we should also recognize that activism mustn't always be defined in those narrow terms. And so activists tend to, and I say this as someone who is an activist, we tend to focus and gravitate on the serious issues, which means that we can kind of have this negative veneer. Everything is doom and gloom, and it's not intentional. It's just that we prioritize which is the cause that's causing the most harm, and it's almost the inverse of Jeremy Bentham's theory of, I've forgotten God, what's it called now? I've lost it. Oh, that's irritating. This whole idea about maximizing kind of like positivity, etc. That's going to really irritate me now.
Utilitarianism.
Utilitarianism, thank you. I knew that would drive me crazy. It's like utilitarianism. It's kind of like, assuming that this is what we're doing. We're always looking, and that's not always the case. Sometimes we are engaged in, and I know Kant was a racist, so I don't normally reference him, but Kantism logic, which also goes the opposite way around, is that we must do things in life that is right. We must make moral decisions. And so as activists, sometimes we'll do things that actually we just need to do self-love today. So we're going to have this campaign against this institution that's preventing humans to engage in self-love. And people, well, hold on, self-love, isn't that a namby-pamby kind of thing? Like, well, no, actually, it's fundamental to our existence. If we don't engage in self-love, we can't do the difficult stuff. So I know that's sort of going around the house just to answer the question. And it's a fascinating question. I never really thought about that, but yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Tony. Thanks, Toyin. And yeah, that leads actually really neatly into our next provocation from my colleague Jess. So Toyin's read this up with some sort of intellectual and philosophical underpinnings to it. Jess now's going to talk about some of her work on a project that's live and she's working on, which will look at maybe some of the practical and the pragmatic ways in which we can navigate some of those philosophical and aspirational agendas within a current university setting. So Jess, over to you to share some of the stuff that you're working.
Thanks, Alina. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Stella Astor. I'm an artist, social researcher, and activist from Leyland in central Lancashire, and I'm also currently a PhD student at Leeds Beckett University. I don't have any slides, which is a little bit unusual. You could say it's an act of epistemic disobedience in a conference to not have slides. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about, like Alina says, kind of a reflection on kind of my PhD journey so far. And also, I'm going to give some kind of provocations and ideas for how people might want to enact kind of ideas for scholar activist practice in their institutions, and just leave a lot of questions to think about. It's very lots of little bits and pieces sort of thing. So I'm currently in the 4th year of my part-time PhD, and in this time I've discovered the potential to achieve activist aims as part of my research. And I've also encountered several barriers to that kind of scholar activist work, or work that sits within a contested interface between scholarship and activism. The first barrier was myself and a failure to enunciate my values, and a lack of support to interrogate and nurture those values and root my research within them. My first proposal was focused on co-producing simulation models with local authorities to help them combat obesity. The work was recuperative in the sense that it tried to achieve social change by appealing to the needs and the aesthetics of knowledge of the dominant system it was trying to intervene in. And it was also not informed by a range of lived experiences. The result was that I began my PhD working on a project which didn't align with my values, which I had actually been neglecting for years. And it's only because a friend critiqued my proposal and pointed me towards fat activism and a wider body of work that was informed by lived experience that I was able to reorient my PhD and begin the difficult work on myself to rediscover my values and to start to think about how I wanted to do research, and then to rebuild my PhD to fit within those more nuanced intentions. It was really hard to do that work after I'd already started my PhD. And I think the truth is that transformative learning, this idea of learning that actually changes who we are, is always difficult. But I think it must be particularly challenging the further we walk down a given path. There's a rigidity which arises in practitioners and institutions over time because we become addicted to life. Our roots tap into the things that we need to sustain ourselves, and when we do that, we grow protective of those things and scared of what might happen if anything was going to change. So I wonder, like, what would it take for a researcher to make a statement like, the last 10 years of my work have been misguided or wrong or harmful? We talk about neoliberalism a lot, and I wonder what would it take for an institution to announce, we'll now only collaborate with workers' cooperatives. We won't work anymore with like for-profit, private shareholder, publicly listed companies. Those are really dangerous things to announce for the people that want to make a change like that. And I think that creates a lot of inertia. And I think that at key points in our lifetimes, we have to choose to commit to either the dynamic uncertainty of change or the rigid certainty of slowly narrowing paths. And there are always ways to change paths and to navigate between these ways of being. And I think that the takeaway for me is that the potentials are much more affordable when we're part of a community that's both critical and caring. So as I went on kind of reading around, I discovered participatory action research. And I also discovered the expectation for researchers to really center themselves in their work. As PhD students, we're examined on our capacity to produce individual contributions to some kind of universal knowledge. I have to write up my findings in my thesis. But instead, participatory research emphasizes messy experiences and emergent methodologies. It's possible to carry out participatory research for a PhD, but it's not possible to get a PhD in research facilitation. It's not enough to enable communities to generate and act on knowledge. We have to demonstrate our ownership of the work. Institutional ethics don't help us with exploring the issues that run through participatory research because the traditional ethical perspective through which these procedures and forms are constructed and the primary objective of the institution not to encourage radical research practices, but to reduce its liabilities. As I've continued on my journey, I've found a few ways to start to respond to some of these issues in my own work. And a big part of that was reconfiguring my practice to center it on local communities. So now my PhD focuses on higher weight people in central Lancashire, and it starts off by enabling participants to share their experiences of weight stigma in healthcare. And there's bits where it kind of builds out from that later on. There's this like the kind of like ecology of knowledge idea where it's about bringing in different kind of perspectives. But the important thing that I found is to maintain the centering of it on those participants and on their experiences. As part of the research design, I've defined an open-ended methodology which uses this idea of choice points for participation. I've tried to leverage traditional social research methods within a participatory methodology so that I can meet both my own needs as a PhD student and also the needs of the participants within the specific situation that my or our research is taking place in. And I started to consider that research practices can lead to non-research outcomes, such as convening a group of people and creating a network or creating a community. And I'm continuing to think about how the relationships I build with participants and the work that we do together can lead to material benefits for them, either as a result of or through the research, or as something that kind of happens as a consequence, as one of these sort of non-research outcomes. I think that community-led research, it has to begin with the needs of a community and it has to enable them to lead on action. And that, as researchers, means putting the needs of local communities above our own research interests. And I think one way that we can do that is by starting with informal inquiries in the places where we already spend our time. Who are the people around us in our sports clubs and our pubs and our children's schools? What are their experiences and what are their needs? As social researchers, that is a really powerful and relevant question for us to consider. And as we build relationships, opportunities to work with people and do research arise naturally. And we can do that work in our own time as well as kind of when we're on the clock at the university, because forming connections in and learning about local communities are valid research practices, and we should resist attempts to define and separate valid and invalid knowledges. So that's kind of where I've kind of gotten to over the last 3 and a bit years. And then I started thinking as part of putting this presentation together, how can we push these transformations into the institutions? How do we transform or reconfigure our institutions as well as ourselves? And how do we move them to center local communities? So I came up with 3 kind of provocative ideas to share. The first one is that I think we need to examine who isn't present in the spaces and the processes of our institutions and bring those people in. Do our funding and ethics panels include local community members? Do they include stakeholders from established organizations? And do those people represent the interests and needs of local people, or are they complicated with vested interests? How much locally funded research is actually happening at our institutions? And is it being led by our communities? And is it facilitating our communities? Or is there something else going on? Secondly, I think that we can look at this idea of establishing local research journals, which specialize in publishing research by, for and about local communities and which publish within our local communities. As academics, we're kind of expected and encouraged to be obsessed with journals and with publishing and writing things up. And I find it really odd that we write in these like really big international spaces, but we don't, especially within social research, and especially as research is concerned with very local effects and systems, we don't have a lot of journals that focus on actually local areas. And I think it's a really direct way to close the loop with social research by feeding those findings directly back into the communities that we've worked with. Those journals should be open access and they should have appealing plain language outputs, and the editorial team should include local community members. And third, I think that we should resist the expansion of city campuses. Land is a scarce resource, and I think that campus expansions are neo-imperialist projects because they convert large areas of land into private property and they concentrate it within the control of wealthy and hierarchical institutions. Instead, universities should be investing in community centres and cafes and libraries and third spaces that are owned by local communities and which can be shared by academics and non-academics alike. In those spaces and researchers, we shouldn't be concentrated in cities, but we should be distributed across the land. We should be in towns and in villages, because that makes research and research practices more accessible to everyone. If that's something that you're interested in, talk to your local renters unions and housing cooperatives for more information about the relationships between your local campuses and the housing supplies in your area. So to kind of just tie all of these things together, I think that these issues and the solutions are really rooted in the ways that institutions and local communities do and don't communicate about and share ownership of projects and resources. And for me, the starting points are these networks of relationships that we form in our own communities, how we're not just researchers, we're people. We exist in places and we are connected and entwined with other people. That is a point from which we can start to build bridges between our communities and our institutions. And it's a very powerful vehicle for change. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella, and thanks for sharing both your personal journey as a researcher, but also moving that back up again to that strategic level about what our universities and institutions could be doing. And but perhaps sometimes some of those things seem a bit, I don't know, pie in the sky or open optimistic, but certainly I've seen examples of that. So a few weeks ago I was in Worcester, and there the university library is the same as the town library, and it's sharing resources with communities and associations as well. So we don't have to be in a neoliberal model. There are definitely other ways of doing things. I'm conscious of time. People may want to have lunch at some point during the day and having regard for their well-being. So we'll probably finish a little bit early. But if people could hang with us for another 10 minutes, it'd be great to have your questions and reflections, perhaps to start with on Stella's presentation, but also on then moving on to the presentations as a whole. So we'll finish a little early, but if you could just stick with us for another 10 minutes, it'd be great to get some of your feedback and your observations. So we're getting some great comments in the chat for you, Stella, about the fantastic and thought-provoking discussions, and thanks for sharing your research. Would anyone like to ask a question or stick their hand up and unmute themselves for Stella's presentation? Toyen, go for it.
Hi, Stella. Thank you for sharing that. It was really inspiring as well. And I think one of the questions there's two questions, or one comment and one question. So the comment would really be, I love the idea about local research journals. It has been done. I think sometimes the language of journal is not always helpful, because then it's kind of like it becomes perceived as a second-class version of an academic journal. So there's something to be said, but the idea of pooling community knowledge together as a repository is actually a great idea. And I think you see that in kind of like archives. But what I'm fascinated about is your own journey, and kind of like you went against this rigidity of research culture, and I'm just wondering, how did it transform you, what, kind of like, as a researcher, as a scholar, what would you describe as effects on you?
I think it's been part of a broader kind of journey over the last like 3-ish years for me anyway. I'm actually not a social researcher by background. My background is actually computer science and software engineering. And I got to a point in my career where I was sick of just working for VC funded companies full time, not doing anything that felt creative or really worthwhile to me. And I needed to pivot my career. I was originally going to start doing a PhD in economics. And then I kind of like went through the kind of journey of, trying to figure out what I wanted to research in terms of like topic area and stuff. Um, and then I ended up with this idea of kind of like a social simulation piece that kind of was based on some of my kind of computer science software background. But I ended up falling into this idea of looking at kind of like obesity and weight. And I'm located within the Obesity Institute at Leeds Beckett University. And it was an area of kind of like health and embodiment that I just had no idea about. And then it became this. I kind of I got called out on it basically by a friend, someone who I've always really looked up to as an activist and a feminist. And so I went off on this whole kind of journey of trying to really understand who were the voices that I wasn't hearing, who were the voices that weren't present in our institution, and who were the voices that were effectively being structurally ignored and that I wasn't being told existed. And so I had to go and find that by myself. And that was at a time when I was also going through a lot of other kind of learning and transformation within myself, with my gender, with my career more broadly, the other role that I moved into while I started my part-time PhD, learning to understand my ADHD and really embrace myself as disabled and really learning to accept that identity. Lots of other kind of things happening in my life at the same time. And I'm really grateful for the space that the PhD has given me over the last 3 years, because it's given me that space to really do a lot of thinking and have a lot of really interesting conversations and enter into and see a different world, that world of academia, and the way that it has these kind of constraints within it and that structure it and shape it. Things that actually I think we can lose sight of. We don't always see the structures and the scaffolding. They become invisible sometimes.
And we think about something with undergraduates, don't we? That kind of hidden curriculum, the things that are happening about university that aren't there. But I think the hidden curriculum is perhaps even more there for PhD students, that we assume people know how the university works and what the structures are and who's around the table. But there's a lot of sort of going on behind the scenes, or things that are assumed, that perhaps that unless your supervisor is advising you about this, perhaps you don't. So yeah, that whole sort of set of hidden structures within universities how we navigate those spaces.
Yeah. Sorry, and I don't know if that really answers your question or not.
No, that was fine. Thank you for sharing as well. That was really insightful. Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, other questions or observations for Stella?
I've got one. Can I jump in?
Go for it, yes.
I was super excited, Stella, when you talked about like material benefits for the communities that you work with, because I think that's like a really key tenet of scholar activism, is thinking about the fact that the institutions that we work in are incredibly wealthy, despite what they tell us consistently about their financial situations. And I was just curious to hear what sort of things you were thinking about. So I think it's we could say really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two main kind of there's two kind of main direct streams to the work, and then there's kind of like a more indirect, longer term kind of approach. So the first one is that there's a kind of module or sub project which I'd like to do, which is basically workshopping with participants to discuss direct and community approaches or responses to weight stigma within healthcare. So within kind of like the fat activist community, you've got people talking about like they have like self-advocacy cards that they can take in. They say like, don't weigh me. If you need to weigh me blind so that I don't know. This is the reason why. And so then that's kind of like patients educating doctors as well about kind of like their needs as higher weight people and how these things are connected into things like eating disorders or other kinds of issues. Or like learning things about self-advocacy around things like pressure cuff sizes, things like that. So it's like I'm wondering like how we can workshop to get people to build those tools for themselves and then go out and actually test them and then have a kind of evaluation piece. So that's actually a discrete sub-project of my PhD. Um, Another one was kind of related to this idea of non-research outcomes from research activities. So one of the things that I'm going to do after the first project, which is all about kind of just sharing experiences, it's just a series of semi-structured interviews basically, is asking participants if they'd like to meet other participants for the purposes of forming a peer support group. And that will be an explicitly non-research space. I will help facilitate people getting together and facilitate that space if people want me to, but it will be a non-research space. There'll be no research, no data generation or collection in there. And I hope that I'll be able to kind of remove myself from that space very, very quickly. So it's just looking at, well, like especially like within this area of research, like there isn't an existing like body positive, like fat acceptance kind of community or anything in the area. So it's the idea of, well, I'm going to be finding a lot of people with very similar embodiments and experiences and bringing them together for my research. It seems a shame to not then turn that into an actual thing that's just here. And maybe people won't want that, but it feels like I should at least offer that as an opportunity to them. And then kind of the third thing is the overall structure of my PhD. I was really excited when you mentioned this idea of ecologies of knowledge because it very much ties into kind of the remainder of like how my research is going to work. So I'm starting off with semi-structured interviews to understand people's experiences of weight stigma in healthcare. And then what I want to do is start from taking a kind of like Deleuzian perspective of this idea of the nomadic researcher. So saying, okay, well, these are the experiences you've had, these are the spaces they've happened in, these are the kinds of people that you've had those experiences with. And then I will go out and talk to those people and start moving through the systems and talking to healthcare professionals, talking to administrators, talking to people in policy, things like that. Using that to then access these other areas of knowledge within the system and then trying to weave it all together. So I'm very interested in this idea that there's everything is a situation and everything is contingent and we have different layers of contingencies and there's so many that it's basically impossible to analyze everything. But I'm wondering, how do you get enough information from all these different layers to understand what the structures and the relationships are between them? So that's kind of a whole piece then about, and the idea there is that it's about explaining people's experiences and explaining their stories. It's not just that this happened to me. It's not that just that this is happening to many people. It's that this is happening because it's contingent on these very many factors, which are all kind of coalescing within this particular point in space and time. And then from there, using that as a body of evidence to then convene a convene a meeting with those people that we then built relationships with within the system to say, well, this is why these things are happening. So can we agree some action points? And that is basically then workshopping, bringing participants with lived experience together with kind of healthcare professionals, policymakers, etc., to build in workshops action plans that they will commit to and then publish them. So it's very much that idea of, well, not just do the research and publish it, but now like, well, we need to actually try and negotiate our process for change as part of the research as well.
I mean, this seems very right. I mean, we heard from Jess a few minutes ago about subverting the research culture agenda. This seems absolutely right for utilizing the research impact agenda. So there'll be real impacts out there in the world. People benefit from this research, and your time working on it, Stella, should be reflected accordingly. So I guess it's an example about building scholar activism that wins, so that the community and the cause that you care about wins, but also that you manage to find academia a place where you can continue to work in and thrive. In the interest of all our well-being, I'm going to bring this session to a close because it's now 1 o'clock, and I think we should have some lunch before sessions start again at 1:30. So thanks again to everyone for joining us for this session. If this is something you've enjoyed or liked, I've shared the Scholar Activist Network in the chat, so do feel free to sign up to get our updates.